means I have to sort of do it like this forward and back, so I'm like this. You're here for the workshop on suicide, people?
Yeah.
Good, you're in the right place. No, don't worry. I'm in the right place as well, that helps. I think most of us are here that we're going to come. If other people come a bit late today, it's still very welcome. Yes, before I say anything else, there's a camera in the corner. This corner is making clips of different things, is how I understand it. So, I hope, just to be honest with you, that it's there. I hope it doesn't stop you from sharing and taking part in the conference, in the meeting that we're having, because that would be a shame. If that's the case, I'll rather turn it off. I think they're just using the images, but I didn't ask. But, if you say something sensitive and you don't want them to record that, come to me afterwards and I'll tell the person there who doesn't record. I'll make sure he takes it down. Okay. Good. Okay. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tim. There's also there to say. What do I do? I'm Tim. I'm Dutch. That's the accent. I'm sorry about that. I am someone who's been working in mental health care and psychiatry for the last 21 years now. First in the Netherlands as a mental health nurse, studied psychiatry, traveled a bit around, lived in a monastery, worked in France, worked in Belgium, worked in the UK, met a girl, fell in love, married, that sort of stuff. Very happy. Yeah, alright, very happy. But she's not here, so I say, well, no, come on. So I've been here. I work in healthcare still, but a few years ago I made a bit of a change. I became a chaplain. Before that, I did a lot of volunteering in chaplains, but now I'm a chaplain, just like Helen, I'll just briefly reintroduce to you in mental health care here in Sheffield with the mental health wards. The rest of my time I do training, consultancy, and I work currently for the Methodist Church in Sheffield. Consultancy contract to help them with all things around mental health, whether it's supporting people, supporting staff, or it's supporting things around people being off ill because of mental health related situations. So that's why I am who I am, and you know a little bit what I do, why I do this workshop. Just to remind you, Helen is here as well. You saw Helen in the beginning. I've asked Helen to sit in with us today, just because I know that the workshop can be quite. The subject can be quite heavy, you know? The subject can be quite heavy with suicide, and that's okay. It's a good thing, because that means we're being honest and open, I think. So, just to let you know, during or after, Helen is here, I'll be here afterwards as well, available for a bit. So do feel free to find us. I really would like to take time, but I don't think we have that much time, but I really would like to know why you're here, really, because I'm surprised that so many of you came. There's a lot of really good workshops, and this might be one that is a bit less cheerful. You can say that, no? Suicide is not a cheerful subject. It's an interesting one, it's a very important one, but it's not very cheerful. I will try to do my best to make some jokes every now and then, but I can't promise they're any good. But I'm happy you're here. I had a plan for the workshop, and then I changed it, and I thought, 2 weeks in advance, I'll have another look at the workshop and then I'll decide what we're going to do. And then I switched my pain medication, which is an antidepressant, low doses, and that went wrong. And I found myself within 24 hours at A&E being suicidal, which is interesting, isn't it? As you're in the middle of preparing a workshop in suicide. So I turned everything over, and we're just going to see what happens today. I'm fine, by the way. It was a chemical reaction. It was a matter of taking my tablets. 3 days later, I felt much better. So that's good to know. Just a warning: if anyone's on amitriptyline, don't suddenly stop. It's very dangerous. Do not do that. Good. So we're going to see how it goes a little bit. Before I'm going to say anything more, I just want us to stop and acknowledge the truth of what we're talking about. We're talking about people taking their own lives, sometimes in very shocking ways, because they can no longer cope with life. That happens to old people, to younger people. And if you saw, I think it was in the Blur, the #1 cause death for those between 10 and 35 is suicide. So taking our lives, not cancer, not accidents, not other illnesses and things, just suicide, doing it to ourselves or taking our own lives away. I also know that statistically, 1 in 6 of us will think of suicide in their lives, or have done so in the past. In this room, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17, so you can think how many of us have thought or might think in the future of suicide statistically. I also know that 40% of us have lost someone reasonably close by, doesn't have to be family, of suicide, so a colleague, a friend, a family member. So keeping all that in mind, and keeping in mind what I've experienced in my life, I just want to make, I can't get my words out right. I just want to stop for a moment and invite you to come up and get one of these heart-shaped things in your hand if you want to. And then you can write on it maybe a name of someone that you've lost to suicide, or someone you've heard of. I think we can all think of someone we heard of. Yeah? It can be a celebrity as well. Yeah? If you can't think of anyone close by, that's good. I'm very happy for you. And then we'll put them on the memory tree. I'll light a candle, and then we really get started. Because I think it's important that we make space for all the feelings that are here as well. Is that okay? Yeah? So do come, pick up a heart. I think you've got all hands in your thing. Yeah, you can take one on one. I've got them all back. So please go for it. When you look up speaking in public or doing workshops, one of the first things I will tell you is to start with a joke, get that going, get the energy flowing. And it feels like we're doing the opposite today, isn't it? But it's really important. It's something I'll speak about later as well, how we Always want to welcome all feelings and all thoughts that exist about suicide, but we'll come back to that later. So the workshop might not be exactly what I said in the blur, because that was a long time ago. But I would like to look with you this morning a little bit about what happens in suicide. I would like to look a bit at how we can respond. And I would like to look a little bit about what we can do to support those who are left behind as well. If at any point you've got any question, please ask. If I don't know the answer, I'll probably know where you can get it. Yeah? So I don't know everything, but I pretty much know where you can get most of the information around suicide. So do feel free to ask. Any questions during the workshop, do feel free to interrupt me as well, because I do it to myself all the time. It's a great job. Good. Now I could be here and talk about suicide from a first aid point of view. Some of you I know have done the training with me as well, mental health first aid. Others of you might have done that. Talks a bit how we respond to a situation when someone is thinking about suicide. Another option would be to use suicide first aid. Really good course, quite intense, but very good. Those are really good ways to learn how to restore to suicide, or someone who thinks of suicide. That's not what we're doing this morning. First of all, because it's not long enough. Yeah? And second of all, because we want to do something slightly different. So this morning I don't really want to look at it from a first aid response kind. I don't even want to look at it specifically from a medical model, although we use aspects of it. But I really want to take a bit of time this morning and use a Bible story that I quite often associate with suicide. And use that story to see what happens and what does that tell us about how we can respond to what happens to someone experiencing suicide. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. Let's say something first about. Does everyone understand why suicide happens? Why does suicide happen? Have a go? You must have a suspicion at least.
People want the pain to end.
Yeah, perfect answer. People want the pain to end. It's not a mystery, it's not complex, it is very emotional, it's very difficult, very dramatic, but in essence it's very simple. You could say people have no longer, or think they have no longer the capacity to cope with the distress they experience, or the pain, suffering, etc. That's when suicide happens. It's that simple, really. I say very deliberately when people think, when someone thinks that they can no longer cope with that. Because we also know in suicide, one person might be thinking of suicide today, but not next week. But then again the week after. That's very normal. Or someone thinks about it for years, and then not for a period, and again for years. It comes in all kinds of forms and shapes. What's really important to remember is that it's about the internal perspective of someone. From the outside, we can see all kinds of reasons why someone will be very well able to cope with what's happening in their lives, but we don't know internal perspective. What we do know is the internal perspective of people quite often is sort of a tunnel vision, isn't it? A tunnel vision that focuses on suicide and isn't realistic when it comes to what else is happening in life. There are exceptions, of course. Good, so suicide happens when we can no longer cope with the pain, suffering, and distress. Suicide, like I said, it's not like a person is just suicidal for a day and then not for the next day or just for one day. It tends to be a progress. People start quite often with having dark thoughts. Depression is quite often present. What else could be present in someone's run-up, you could say, to thinking about suicide? What might be happening in someone's life?
Abuse.
Abuse, yeah.
Death.
Deaths of
Death.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Feeling alone and lost.
Feeling alone, lost, yeah, isolation, yeah. Same thing, yeah. Trauma, yeah, really good, yeah. Abuse and trauma, I won't put that in one thing because that's what we're talking about really, is traumatic experience, yeah, really good. What else can we see quite often around suicide, run up to suicide? Rejection?
Yeah.
By who?
By the community, by the family, by the people who they love, but they feel no longer
Yeah.
feeling isolated, questions over sexual identity,
Yeah.
feeling you're not part of the people who you call family.
Yeah. And who are you rejected by most, do you think?
The people you love.
Yourself.
Yeah, yourself. But you're right, that happens as well, that all happens. And every situation is different, yeah? So not one person, not the other. So we've got this idea, I've just put a line up here, which is the continuum of suicide. And the continuum is just a line, we're all on the continuum, we're all on this continuum. I hope most of us are on this side where it says not suicidal and not towards this end. If you are a bit further towards the suicide end, you feel free to come and talk to Helen and me afterwards. Yeah? That would be really good. But it's not just going from one moment to the next. Normally there's this whole situation build up. Sometimes it's visible to the person himself, sometimes it isn't, sometimes visible to others, sometimes it isn't. So we could put things like dark thinking, isolation, trauma, but also things like self-harm, substance misuse. They could be very well in there as well. Other mental health conditions, depression is present in one form or another. Most of the time there's sort of this time cycle. Every now and then, someone goes from almost nothing to suicide very quickly. Do we know why that is? There's two reasons why that might happen. It very quickly happens.
Could it be like you said, a chemical reaction?
Ah, that's three. Yes, that's true. That is one. Yeah. See, that's not what I thought of very often until a few weeks ago. So thank you. Yeah. So three. I'll take that one. It's two others that change. But maybe just go from nothing to suicide very quickly.
I guess in a circumstance that someone dies or something happens.
So a traumatic event. A traumatic event can, and a traumatic event, you know what the number one traumatic event is for someone to complete suicide? It's relationship breakdown. So you know, yeah. So does it happen in young people? Relationship breakup? Yeah, it's a time of life where you trial and error with relationships. And if it's your first time, it can be really hard, can't it? Really hard, because you don't know what to do, what's going up and down. So something to keep in mind. So traumatic event, and the other one is use of drugs and alcohol. Yeah? They take away our inhibition, so that makes the step very, very short. In general, those are the very dangerous situations. We need to respond very quickly. If someone is more on a longer trajectory towards suicide, we don't know where someone is, of course, unless we ask, then we can always, I don't want to say we can take more time, but then it's much more a case of finding out where someone is really, but maybe that's for another time and place. Last thing I want to say really before I go to the Bible story, which I promised, is that, do you know what is the, no, let me put up the statistics, it's easier. 78% of people who take their own lives are male, just to point it out. Of them, 60% has never, so this is for young people aged 10 to 35, 60% has never asked or talked with anyone about their feelings or thoughts around suicide. 60%. The way to prevent someone from taking their own lives is by connecting with them and carrying them from moment A to B. Yeah? Like I said, someone isn't suicidal every day of their lives, or at least not as high a risk every day of their lives. And it's getting a person from moment A to moment B. If someone is suicidal, moment A, try to get them to moment B, where they're somewhat safe. If we don't know what's happening in the other person's mind, we can't do anything. Can't do anything. So the number one thing we can do to prevent suicide is talk about suicide. It's really important. This is what the Samaritans say as well. Pegasus, really well-known mental health first aid. England says it. Support after suicide. They've got some reference at it. The most important thing we can do to prevent suicide happening is actually talking about suicide. And specifically asking one question. What is that question? What is the most important question we can ask?
Are you okay?
No, but that's a good question.
What's wrong?
No?
How do you feel?
No?
Can you help?
No? Are you
Do you want to
thinking?
talk?
Are you thinking of taking your own life? Very important. Very important question. Just to say that, because if we don't ask, we don't know. So that reduces that 60% of people have no help or support to try to prevent suicide. We can change that number by asking the question, do you think of taking your own life? So please feel free to ask that question. I ask it quite often inappropriately, just sort of joke people a little bit. You know, I know birthday parties, that works normally really well. And you laugh. And you know how often people afterwards come up to me and start talking to me about something they've experienced with someone else. Yeah? You laugh, but it's true. Yeah, it is inappropriate all the time. Good, okay, I've got so much to say it's useless. Any questions so far?
Can I ask?
Yeah.
No, if you ask somebody, are you thinking of taking your own life?
Yeah.
How can you make sure that they tell you the truth and they don't hide it?
No, you can't. No, you can't. But you can increase your chances, I would say. And that was why some of the other things you said. How are you? You want to sit down, want a cup of tea, maybe time for you, I'm going to tell me more. And so really try and make someone feel welcome and safe. Yeah? This morning, what's her name again? Sorry. What's the name of the young lady who was speaking this morning? Hannah. She said something about safe spaces, no? Didn't she say that? So make sure that someone feels like it's a safe place. That increases your likelihood of getting an honest response. Yeah. When you don't know, you don't know. So if you don't know what you do, you ask again. At another time perhaps. Yeah. Good question. Good. Okay. Right. I'm all over the place this morning. I'm very sorry. Who does suicide happen to? Who can suicide happen to? Anyone. Is there a difference between people who are very strong belief or not? Okay. Yes? Someone brave enough to say yes? No. Sorry. It's really difficult to say that. It's a difficult question. It's a good question, isn't it? Does it make a difference if our faith is strong, that we're less likely to end up taking our own lives? That's a different question actually, I'm sorry. My original question was, can it happen to someone who has a very strong faith? Yeah. Does it change if you've got a strong faith perhaps? Can it change that?
I think it can change definitely when you do it. You might feel suicidal, but so you can remind of why you've got a lot of reason to live. You know.
Yeah. So it's not a bow in your quiver, arrow. What do you say in English?
Yeah.
It's not a resource, isn't it? So in that sense, yes, it can definitely help, but you're not excluded. Yeah, it's not a get out of jail free pass. Which is why I want to just read you a really short story in the Dutch English to you about Elijah. I really like Elijah. So Elijah, just to quickly say what happened. Elijah there was this drought, and then he went up to the mountain. You know the story. Yeah, these Baal priests were doing all kinds of things. It wouldn't rain, and Elijah then made it rain after he prayed to God. God made it rain. So Elijah performed a miracle on God's behalf. Elijah's done quite an astonishing amount of miracles up to this point, very close to God, communicates with God. So really, a very strong pillar of faith. You could say, I think he's a brilliant example of someone who really lives very close to God and is very full of his faith. And then Jezebel hears everything and wants him killed, basically. And so what happens? He flees, and then this story happens. He was afraid and fled for his life. He came to Beersheba, a town of Judah, where he left his servant. He himself went into the desert a day's journey, and sitting under a fir bush, wished he were dead. God, he said, I've had enough. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down and went to sleep. All of a sudden an angel touched him and said, Get up and eat. He looked round, and there at his head was a scone baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate, he drank, and then he lay down again. But the angel of God came back a second time, touched him and said, "Get up and eat, or the journey will be too long for you." I really like this story because the first thing that we notice is that Elijah, this pillar of faith, has a bit of a crisis, really, doesn't he? It's a bit of a crisis. And what is his response? He's done. He wants to die. God, take my life away. Yeah? I don't know whether I would call it suicide or not. What I do know is that it's very close to what I know as suicide. Yeah? So I think it's really important to realize straight off the bat that suicide is very common. It happens everywhere. It happens to all of us. And it's a reality even a long, long time ago in the Bible. Elijah is a very clear example of that. I find it very comforting. To think, oh, I'm in good company. That's a way of looking at it, yeah? That's a way of looking at it. But it also demystifies. I think in church, especially with young people, talking about suicide, making it normal is really important. And again, it comes back to the 60% that take their own life without ever having a chance to talk to anyone. Why do you think they don't talk? Why do you think they don't ask for help?
I think they're being more.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah. Stigma and discrimination. Yeah? Stigma and discrimination. Stigma and discrimination are the main causes why people don't access help anywhere, specifically around suicide. So for us, as people who work with young people, children, the encouragement really to talk about suicide. And if you're not comfortable about talking about suicide with young people, do a mental health first aid course, do a mental health, or do a suicide first aid course, go to Samaritans online, Pegasus online, find resources and see if you can find something that is helpful. But talk about it. It's really important. Because if you're preemptively have a conversation with them and tell them that it's really important to talk about suicide, and tell them that it's normal to ask each other the question, you have made a game that the medical world cannot make. The medical world can't do this. We need to, in younger generations, instill the idea that it's okay to talk about suicide. Really important. Number one thing you can do to prevent suicide. Number one thing. And so, bring that back in a church context. Elijah is a good example. I think especially a lot of the younger people that have been brought up in the church will know the stories of Elijah. Quite spectacular stories, right? So it's a known figure perhaps as well, so we can use that. Any thoughts about that? Because I just share what I thought, but what do you think? Any thoughts about this? You all agree?
Can talking about it sow a seed of questioning when you are feeling suicidal?
What do you think?
I don't know.
Okay, no, that's a honest answer. Does anyone not Alex? Not Helen. Does anyone know the answer to that is? It's a good question.
I think for me, what is worrying is it seems in the last few years it's almost become a trend among young people to self-harm.
Mm-hmm. Self-harm, yeah. Which is something different. Yeah.
Well, with a lead to suicide. See, I've got a 24-year-old daughter who has had suicidal thoughts, and what worries me, there's websites on how to do it.
Yeah.
You know, you can look up online
Yeah.
how to do it, and that worries me. Is that, you know, it in the same way, I think that was your question of sowing seeds. So,
yeah, I think those are two very different things. To point out, the concern of website is really good. That's why I always say go with the charities you know. If you say, oh, have a look online, don't say have a look online, say have a look at this website. Yeah? Samaritans, Pegasus, there's loads for it. Those are the main two that I use around suicide, but there are loads. Make sure you check the information first. Come back to your question again. Anyone know the answer to that? Does it sow seeds?
I don't know.
Why doesn't it sow seeds?
Because I think if a young person was feeling, if any person was feeling that low, that they would have probably had that thought already, and they might be relieved that you were the one bringing it up in conversation, because it opens the floor there.
Yeah. So this is really good. So because that's the benefit of it, yeah. So that's the benefit, clear benefit. But first, let's talk about the risk. There has been a lot of research for many years. Not recently. We're talking about from way back the 60s and the 50s already. A lot of research about the idea. Can we actually put the idea of suicide in someone's mind? And the answer to that is no. You cannot put the idea of suicide in someone's mind. Let alone by mentioning or asking the question. Yeah? So these were studies specifically looking at can one person make it in their life. Now that's different when someone is very fragile or vulnerable. But at that point, what goes is what Megan just said, that the opportunity to share outweighs any risk. But actually just asking the question is very clear, there's absolutely no evidence that it puts the idea of suicide or seed of suicide in someone's mind. It doesn't work like that. And I think it comes a bit about the sort of mystification around what suicide is. Suicide is actually really simple. It's actually really simple. You are not thinking of taking your life unless something is really wrong in your life. So if the response to someone asking you the question is triggering, what does that say? It says that you should have a conversation with someone, that something's actually wrong. So no, the answer to that is no, it doesn't. It's for the evidence is very clear. What it does do is give opportunities, which is again really important to reduce that number. Now it feels maybe a bit strange, but the science has been very clear for a very long time, and it keeps reinforcing that. So we have to trust a bit in that. But I know the hesitation. I felt that as well. But yeah, I trust that. Yeah. Now I made some notes, but I got them on my phone. So unprepared because I left that there last night. I would like to look at what happens next in the story. So Elijah has clearly this idea that he wants to die. He said enough, there's a crisis, you could say a traumatic environment, he needs to flee from his life. Suicide is there, the idea of not wanting to live at least is there, very clearly, asking God to take his life away, that it's been enough. And what happens next is really interesting. I like this idea of this angel in so many ways. What happens is that an angel comes, shakes him awake, says, there's food, eat and drink. Often people say to me, what can I do if I support a young people who is suicidal? And the answer is very simple. It's very simple. Listen. Your first main priority is to listen. You listening prevents them from taking their lives in this moment, first of all. And second, it might help to carry them from moment A to B. And third, if you've done something like a mental health first aid course, which you should do if you work with young people, it then gives you the information to keep someone safe, like perhaps involving other services, parents, and so on. So, where was I going with my train of thoughts? Yes, so what do? The most important thing is to listen. And I think if I'm going to listen to a young person, I tend to not listen like this. So if you like to talk about something in here, I would like to listen to you. And it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So what do? Coffee, tea, ice cream, hot chocolates, play a game, put a board game out, have a chat, yeah? Being normal but engaged. So the idea of the angel giving food and water is not that strange at all. I quite like that. It's a very basic thing. And what happens next, what Elijah does, I like even more. Because what does Elijah do? Doesn't say anything, he just goes back to sleep. I don't know if you've ever had an angel wake you up, give you food and water. I don't think I would go back to sleep. I would be calling people, checking myself into the hospital. No, I don't know, maybe a bit scared. But it's interesting though, that Elijah is really so done, and that's a response that you might have experienced and else will experience when you're supporting people, especially young people, when they're ill. We say depression, quite from low mood, which is very close to suicide. So when they have suicidal thoughts as well, the response might be nothing. And it's really important for us not to be discouraged, because you have no idea how important that cup of tea, that board game, that hot chocolate is to the other person. You have absolutely no idea. When I talk with people in the hospital as a chaplain, especially afterwards, when people are feeling a bit better and ask them what kept you going in the last period before you came to the hospital, what kept you going? I don't know, Helen, if you've had experiences as well, but quite often it's very simple things. It's going to a lunch club, it's being welcomed somewhere, it's part of a group, that sort of thing. So the example of the angel is really good. And the response of Elijah is very genuine. It's really well noticed. But he didn't say the first one, I just want to say. And again the angel comes. We can say that again God comes. Again the angel comes and does the same thing with a few more words of encouragement. And that's really important. Keep going at it, keep going at it, keep going at it, keep going at it. Don't give up, don't get frustrated, don't judge, don't get angry, but just offer over and over moments of interaction, moments of safety, safe spaces. You heard the word this morning already. Really, really important. If you want to know what to do to prevent someone from taking their own lives, just talk to them, listen to them, and make sure that they're alright and try again next time. Because we know that the majority of cases, young people do not share with others when they are thinking of taking their own lives. So the easiest way to get there is again asking the question, you think about taking your own lives. We increase our chances of success of an honest answer or a truthful answer by having that interaction with them over and over again. Now I'm not saying ask someone constantly when they're thinking of taking their own lives, that might get annoying. But do ask, do ask, do ask. It's okay to ask. Short story, I was doing some stuff in the garden, my neighbor was up on the ladder and I said, oh Mick, you're right. You don't look very happy. Mick, what's up? And he's like, oh, just, time of year, lack of life, blah, blah, blah. So Mick, you think about taking your own life? And he just stopped and looked at me and said, how do you know? I said, well, I didn't until just now. I just thought I should ask him. We had a really long conversation, he's okay. But it's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. What is the worst that can happen? He says no. Yeah? Because if you say yes, it's really good. Now we can interact, now we can do something. If someone says no, we don't. I want to set a bit of time aside for talking about how to interact with people after someone's taken their own life. But this is just up to. Any questions about this? Any questions around suicide that you've got about supporting someone?
Mine's a little bit connected to the other lady about self-harm. So, can it be the case that if you have perhaps a year at university or in a school, if one person commits suicide, then it's no longer the enormous thing that many people think it is for somebody who already isn't in a good place. That there can be a knock-on effect, that it becomes more, not exactly commonplace, but more familiar.
So the risk gets higher.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the case. So talking about someone about suicide doesn't increase the risk of suicide. What does increase the risk of suicide is being exposed at a close and family member, close friend, in a school group of suicide. That does, and that increases everyone's risk of suicide only for a short period of time, especially the first week. It's really important to keep an eye on that. But that's true. Yeah. And it's the exposure of the trauma more than the fact that it's suicide, which makes it interesting. Again, brings us back to trauma. Trauma brings us suddenly close to suicide. So it's not so much the suicide, it's the trauma of the suicide that does this.
So if you had two suicides a year apart, not necessarily connected?
No, not necessarily, but every situation is different. What we do see, for instance, in families where suicide has happened, that there's higher chance of suicide happening. And that's not genetic. We know that's not genetic. There's no genetic predisposition to suicide, but it has to do with seeing how accessible perhaps is. Yeah. But what I was trying to refer to is, I think we were talking about the initial peak in the weeks after. There's definitely, because there's been a traumatic event, there's definitely an increased risk of suicide for the people close by. So when I go to school sometimes, or being called, and there's been a suicide in a group, then there's a very strict follow-up, very intense follow-up with the students, or even with at workplaces. If it happens at work, it happens even in our trust, unfortunately, with staff. Then there's a whole program that starts to make sure we check on people in the coming weeks a lot, because we know the risk is really high. Good question. All good questions. Amazing. Any other questions? It's your time, you know. Have a bit of a go. Okay. I'll explain something more when we've got a bit of time left. Right, so I think one of the questions that joining people asked was to look at what do we do when for those who remain behind after suicide, because that's really hard as well. So you might have young people, and also maybe family members of young people. I know when I was a youth worker, it wasn't necessarily young people I was listening to. Part of them was a parent as well, because there are concerns there as well. So it's not just young people, it's really mixed. But it's a reality that if you're in that situation, perhaps you work in a school, there's a suicide unfortunately, perhaps you can help there to listen. It would be really good if you could, if you feel you're up to it. But what can we do? What can we do? What do you think we can do? What do you think we can do for those who stay behind?
I think often the people that are left would maybe blame themselves and think, oh, if I only had done this or been there at the right time, or been kinder, or I think that a lot of people would be feeling a lot of self-blame, so I guess having space to talk about it and reassure people.
Yeah, really important, yeah, so...
Just the feeling of guilt, it was my fault, I was
Yeah, it's very common, very common. Yeah,
I think perhaps making it okay to talk about the person who has committed suicide is important. I think suddenly, like, because it was so traumatic, you don't want to bring it up again, but actually they need to grieve part of that grief. I don't know, I think.
Yeah, no, you were doing really well till you said need, but no, we could say people need to grieve in their own way, of course. Yeah, no, it's really important. The most important thing I always take with me that I've learned over the years, especially for people who are very good at supporting on this, is that whatever thoughts or feelings are present are okay. So those are thoughts and feelings of sadness, of loss, of guilt, of anger, of rage, all those are welcome. Whether I technically agree with them or not is irrelevant. If I'm going to support someone, it's really irrelevant. There will be a time and place, if they really have questions, there's a time and place later on to talk to them. I'm not going to force my perception on someone else. Why? Because losing someone to suicide is incredibly traumatic. I don't know if any of you been there or support someone who's been there. It's really a traumatic experience, and so we can apply the rules we apply for every traumatic situation someone has just gone through, and is that we do not force anything, but we receive everything. Yeah? Remember that. Don't force anything, receive everything. If you do that, you got 90% well done. Really important. We never force, because we make it harder to share, we make it harder to live through, we make it harder to talk about later when they're ready, when someone's ready. So we never force someone to share. We can ask questions, yeah, that's fine. Ask questions, we don't force. And always welcome everything, whatever it is. And that's really hard. It's really hard. I remember a funeral of my cousin who took his own life over Christmas, 2 little children. It was really horrible. And there was this funeral, and this best man wanted to speak as well. And can you imagine? There was this place, everyone's really sad and crying and silent and just, you can imagine what the atmosphere must be like, right? And he came on and he just a proper shout and was really angry and was, I can't even say it, sure. I wasn't Dutch, so I can't say it. It was a proper go at it. And it was really hard for everyone to hear, and yet it was real. It was real. He was angry that he left without saying. He was angry that he left his children behind. He was selfish because he did Christmas and yada 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 yada. That's it. Now I felt very different, but if we're going to support someone, then we have to welcome everything. That means also welcoming them inside of us. Sorry, you want to say?
It's okay, I was just thinking a lot about people feeling angry as well.
Yeah.
And if there's anything extra or different that we can do to kind of, if we need to be able to calm them down a little bit, or
No.
just the same things apply.
Try to protect the other people around as well, I would say, but besides that, no, anger is not a bad response. We see anger as a bad thing. Anger is a really good response. If someone has no response, I'm more worried. And I'm more worried.
My son's best friend killed himself when my son was 13, and he went through they grew up overnight and stuff. So we went through all the anger, we went through all the upset, and then the anger came. And I'm no training at all, but I kind of, and I don't know whether this is the right or wrong way, but I kind of turned that anger into a positive, because now my son's older, it's 4 years ago. He actually looks back on that now, and the anger that he had then he still has, and he realises that being in that situation and the lives, it affects everybody's lives, it's not just that individual, so he uses that as a positive now, and I kind of encourage that, because he says, well, it'd be really selfish of me or any of my friends to do that because of the devastation of what he leaves behind, and I don't know whether that's a right or a wrong thing to encourage, or...
I think it's really good. No, I think it's really good. I mean, the more you learn about sports all around trauma, which is what we're talking about, it's trauma, yeah? It's linked to suicide, but it's pure trauma. That's what someone goes through. You have to welcome it all.
He's still got if we talk about him all the time, he's an example throughout his life, but he's still got that there, and which, as I say, what would he do? And I know my son's actually spoke to other people about that and what happens and how they live with it afterwards, and hopefully that will have done some good, and some good has actually come out of it.
Well, the fact that he talks about it will have done some good. Like, as I keep repeating, we need to talk about suicide. And who better to talk about suicide in a positive way, because it is positive, whether we like it or not.
I think the school really with all of them, like they weren't allowed to see the coffin arrive, they all had to be inside, so the children didn't see it arrive, and the school were really, really good. And they spent a lot of time with the affected children afterwards. I think that did help. But as a parent with a 13-year-old, what do? We've got no training in this kind of thing.
No, the same thing you do with a 30-year-old or a 60-year-old. Yeah, it doesn't change. There's no quick fix. I mean, it sounds a bit like, oh yeah, you can't do anything. No. You can do a lot. It's just very straightforward, but very difficult to execute. What you need to do is listen, don't force, welcome everything. That's all you need to do. It's very simple until you need to do it, and then it becomes very difficult. If you want to know a bit more, the support after suicide, it used to be called different, but it doesn't matter, they still have similar resources. They produce this booklet, which is free, but now it's all online anyway, which is really helpful. Definitely worth having a look at, especially just to have, in case you are in an unfortunate situation where you need support, when people, adults, around suicide, really good support, have a bit of a read through. But just remember, don't force welcome everything. Don't force welcome everything. And you're doing a really good job. You're doing a really good job. I'm cautious we've got 10 minutes. I've got a whole bag of tricks we can open up, but maybe there's questions which might be better.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
I'm a secondary school teacher,
Yeah.
and I teach PSHE,
I don't know what it stands for.
personal social and health education.
Yeah.
We've been asked not to change our language around suicide, so
Yeah.
to not say commit suicide, but death by suicide.
Yes.
So we talk to the students about that because they all still say committed and we're talking about that. Do you think that language change will help reduce the stigma?
No and yes. No, changing the words won't change it. What it will do is open conversations. So I always say complete or die by suicide, which both of them are okay. And quite often, so why do you say complete? And I say, well, because we have some new conversation about suicide. So that's why I think it's helpful.
It's the word commit, isn't it? That's what we were told that I'm in primary, we were told the word, to use the word commit, because that after some sort of blame.
Yeah, so I mean, that idea of blame will still be there unspoken, but it's good to not to say the word commit. Which is much more interesting is to say, why don't we say commit? Communicate that with students, to pupils. So you don't say it because it's not a crime. Which brings you in a whole different territory of should we then be able to choose whether you could die or not? But that's another conversation you can have with them. But it's good language. It's I try not to use commit suicide. Every now and then I do it to slip off the tongue, and it doesn't make you a bad person. At least I don't think so. But complete suicide, die by suicide, definitely prefer to language itself doesn't never change anything because then the words change again and again and again. But it's good to be precise. It is no longer a crime, so that's a fact. That is why it was called. That's why we used to say commit. It was a crime. It's no longer a crime, luckily. So therefore, it's no longer commit. It's complete or die by suicide.
That's a really interesting point because, you know, the language around it commit, because it was a crime, and obviously, historically, in Christianity, you could be buried if you killed over. But also, the law still sees it as a crime almost, because insurance companies will not pay out for anyone who's committed suicide. And so that language is still, I think there needs a lot of work. I'm someone who's lost quite a few people to suicide. And I still see that word commit, maybe it's my age. But I think we really need to start changing that language around it, and I think that's so important because it's not something I ever thought about before. It is death by suicide. It's an illness that kills you.
It's not an illness, sorry, I need to say that, but it's not an illness.
Well, that's what happens,
yeah.
that can lead to that.
Yeah.
And therefore why, insurance companies are still punishing people. And their families, for example, a family of someone who dies by suicide will not be able to get their insurance. So I think it's a really interesting subject to talk about the language around it.
Language is important. If it reduces stigma, it's useful. Yeah, because again, stigma and discrimination is reduced by 60%. It's quite a lot, isn't it? If you know that the success rate of interacting with people around suicide is really high, it's a big deal. Right?
And I just want to ask, we talked a lot about young people, but my family, we've had a death by suicide quite recently, and there's quite a lot of children in our family, and I just wondered if there's anything different you would do to talk to a child about someone in their life who has, died by suicide, and not talking kind of primary age.
Yeah, I had this conversation with my daughter who was 4 at the time, she just turned 5. I had this conversation with her when she asked, who is Michiel? Who's my other cousin. I lost 2 cousins from different sides of the family, strangely. Who's Michiel? Because we were talking about it. So it was Danny's cousin. Like Sammy is your cousin. Michiel was Danny's cousin. Oh, okay. So where is he? So Michiel is dead. Was he sick? Yeah, sort of sick. People are sick in their body. He was sick in his head. And that's why he couldn't live anymore. And he died. How did he die when he was sick in his head, Daddy? It's that sort of conversation.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Because he thought, and this is what I said to her, because he thought that tomorrow was always going to be more difficult than today. I know it sounds horrible, right? That's all that came to mind, that's what I said. And so he decided he didn't want to live anymore. Huh. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I don't know how much you got of it. The only thing that I think is important is that we had a conversation. And however little she understands, I don't care. Not that suicide should ever be the norm, but to accept that this norm, prevalent in our society, is really important. So how do you talk about it with a young child? As you would talk about any other thing. Use simple language, don't expect too much. Even if you say they were ill in their head, or they were ill in their mind, or their heart was so sad, I've heard someone say this, their heart was so sad that they couldn't beat anymore. I know, again, sick, very sweet. But if that makes sense to a child, use that. You start by laying the foundation for later on. When they're older, you can have that conversation. And even then it will be more difficult because then you have to start using your own language. I think hiding it from children is a bad idea.
Yeah, exactly.
I think imposing it on them is also a bad idea. But when they come with questions, try to. Again, you can't put the idea in their head. It's not how it works. So don't be afraid of that. It's a bit of a weird workshop, this. Whose idea was this? Bit of a weird. Got a few more minutes. I want to, can I advertise something for you? It's not specific suicide, it's mental health and Christianity. So, the 14th of May 2022 at Wesley Hall, so the other building we're using as well today, there is a conference on mental health and Christianity. You can find information on mental health and Christianity from Sheffield on Facebook. You can find it by. I was going to print things on my laptop broke last night, so I couldn't print those. I didn't brought things with me. Email me, and I'll send you the information. Info at. I think this is my email. So info at pontestraining.co.uk. Email me and I'll send you the information. Or look at Facebook, it's advertised there. I should have flyers with me, but then my laptop broke. I was lazy, I waited the last moment to print it. Any last questions? Anything you would like to say?
Is it ever useful to share your own experiences as long as you make sure you're not projecting your own feelings? If you're talking to somebody, is it helpful or is it better?
Depends. In general, when we listen to someone, we don't want to impose our story. That doesn't matter what we talk about or what we listen about. But there are moments when it's useful. So in a youth group, I would share perhaps what I've experienced first to then open the floor. If I've not experienced, I'll take someone else's story. So I use it in the same way then. Yeah, that's how I would use it. Yeah, of course, if you've got something, as long as you leave space for the young people, that's really important. I often talk about my experience, so that's yeah. Not the one of Jansen, by the way, that's why he said that was a new one. Right, thank you everyone. I think it's time for lunch. I'm not being hungry now.
No, there's another workshop yet.
Is another, oh, is that another workshop? Oh, sorry. Another workshop. Thank you for coming. Shall I take the hearts with me?
Yeah.
You want to take them with you?
Yeah.
Good. You know what? You want to take them with you, and I'll take them with you. Thank you for coming. Keep the rest of the